Welcome to the second beta lecture in the church history course, the second of 3 introductory lectures. And we dealt with the Greek world in the first lecture. Second lecture will deal with the Roman world. And I want students to examine the unique purposes which drove the Roman people. And that will help explain some of the friction that the church has with them later on down the line. Secondly, the student will explore the development of Roman history. Unfortunately, I can't assume that everyone that comes into class has a background in history, and that's not a problem. We'll go through some of the important events in Roman history, at least for the development of the church. And thirdly, this lecture will prepare the student to discuss the history of Rome and how it shaped and molded culture and how the church interacted with that. And we'll do that in class. But to begin with, I want to talk about the Romans as the heir to the Greeks. Just as the dream recorded in Daniel chapter 2 foretold, there would be a succession of empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, before the Messiah would come, before the church proper started. Now, Rome itself emerged in the late 8th century BC, and it grew to cover the known world. And what made the Romans so effective was their capacity for cultural exchange. When Rome conquered a territory, it absorbed the best aspects of that culture and conferred upon it the best aspects of Roman culture, most importantly their concept of citizenship. And while Rome fought their way across most of the Mediterranean, many of the civilizations they conquered ended up thriving under Roman leadership. And the Romans benefited from few cultures as much as they benefited from Greek culture. Rome's republican system of government proved to be more stable than the Greek democratic system. However, the thought, the art, the architecture of Greece provided Rome the sophistication its warrior culture did not have in and of itself. I want to talk a little bit about some Roman innovations, things that they didn't absorb from other cultures, but things that they developed on their own, and these would prove very helpful to the spread of the church. First, Roman government was discernibly different. Greek government, its democracy was usually a cycle where democracy devolved into oligarchy, things got really bad, and a tyrant had to come and overthrow the oligarchy, reestablish stability so that a democracy could be reformed. And most city-states went through a constant cycle of this. Now, Rome started as a monarchy, but beginning in 509 BC, Rome deposed their kings. They deposed the concept of kingship from their society and adopted a republican form of government that was much more stable. Roman citizenship gave people a sense of belonging and a sense of legal due process. Not just a sense of, but actual legal due process that allowed them to travel throughout the Roman Empire, to travel safely, to travel predictably. You'll know what you'll get in Hispania as you would get in Britannia, as you would get in Mauritania, all that sort of stuff. What church history courses talk a lot about, and for good reason, was Roman infrastructure. It's roads, and how it connected large cities of commerce where goods and ideas were exchanged, and how the Roman military would travel on these roads. That's what they were designed for. But merchants and traders would travel these roads. Missionaries would travel these roads. They became the vessels and artery of cultural exchange. But of all these innovations, the most important ones were codified in their myths. And I want to talk about 2 founding myths that the Romans developed. And the first one will be Virgil's Aeneid. And even though it talks about the origins of Rome, which happened in the late 8th century BC, Virgil wrote the Aeneid around 25 BC, or shortly after Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire. So it's serving an imperial purpose. It's giving imperial justification for that change, right? And Virgil wrote it as an epic poem, not necessarily to relate its history, but to explain this driving force behind who Rome is and why the empire is actually the best way to do that. It describes what should motivate a good Roman and bind everyone together. So keeping that in mind, let's review some of the main points of the story of Aeneas. And Aeneas was a citizen of Troy when Menelaus, Achilles, and the Greeks arrived to lay siege to the city. This is the story of the Iliad. And while Troy seemed to gain the upper hand in the conflict, the Greeks plotted to enter the city by deception through a Trojan horse, a phrase that is a part of modern discourse. Now Aeneas did not know that Troy was to fall the next day, but Jupiter, the chief of the gods, appeared to Aeneas and to break the news to him. And Jupiter commissioned Aeneas to take his family, to escape from the city, and most importantly, found a new city, a city like Troy. So Aeneas took his father Anchises on his back and his son Ascanius by the hand, and he fled the city under cover of darkness. And the story of the Aeneid follows Aeneas and the band of followers he gathered around the Mediterranean to fulfill this quest to find a new city. And one of the stops they made along the way was the city of Carthage, a previously existing Phoenician city, a city that gave Rome no end of grief during the Republic. And when Aeneas landed there, he fell in love with Queen Dido. Dido fell in love with him, and they planned to get married. And then on the eve of their wedding, Jupiter reappeared to Aeneas and said, "What are you doing? Like, I commissioned you to go found a new Troy, not to marry the queen of a previously existing city. Carthage isn't good enough for you. Carthage is bad news," which all Romans during the empire knew because of the Punic Wars. So before the crack of dawn, Aeneas gathered his followers and he set sail, and Queen Dido woke up just in time to see her beloved sailing off into the sunrise. And she did what any normal person would do, is to kill herself, apparently. So it's this very dramatic, tragic story. But it showed that Aeneas, if he was to fulfill Jupiter's commission, falling in love was only a hindrance to that, right? So then eventually Aeneas and his band of merry followers ends up on the west coast of Italy, and they were eating what provisions they had left, and Aeneas notices something very interesting. His men had made some grain meal and put it on a leaf and rolled the leaf up and started to eat it, inventing, as Francis Titchener said, the first burrito, right? And Aeneas recalled the prophecy of Jupiter that you will have arrived at this place when your men eat their plates. And at the time, Aeneas had no idea what that referred to, but now, seeing them eating their food off the leaves, he saw they're eating their plates. And this is where they settled to found the region of Latium. It says not the city of Rome itself, but the region from which Rome would come. So if this epic poem doesn't tell us a whole lot about the actual history, what does it tell us? It tells us a lot about the cultural values that were important to Rome at the inception of the empire. And one of those cultural values was antiquity. Rome rejected new stuff, and they always deferred to old stuff. And this is why it was important for Rome to realize that their city was never invented as a new city. It was a descendant of a very old city, Troy. And this respect for antiquity was known by the Latin phrase mos maiorum, or the custom of the ancestors. And when Romans would argue about something, what would usually settle any argument was an appeal to the ancestors. Well, this is the way our ancestors did it. Case closed, right? So the Aeneid tells us that Rome is actually the descendant of a very old and ancient city, because antiquity is important to them. Secondly, battle bravery. The idea of the Greeks sneaking into the city under their deception was not the sort of bravery any Roman general in the empire wanted their subjects to default to. Romans were to be courageous and fierce and brave, not deceptive. Not that they didn't use deception, but their deception was to a fierce and violent end. It wasn't a way around violence, so to speak. This is why Jupiter spared Aeneas, because the Greeks were cheating. They were not fighting in a manly way. Third value this story tells us was the importance of the state. And the episode with Queen Dido is instructive, because when Aeneas fell in love with Dido, Jupiter reminded him that his obligation to the state was actually more important than his own personal feelings. And while love was an important part of Roman culture, still is today. Actually, the Latin name for Rome, Roma, is the Latin word amor, backwards. Rome always had a sense that love is not what helps you become a man. It actually interferes with that. What helps you become a man is devotion to the state. And that approach to love would dominate until the 11th century in Europe, where C.S. Lewis realized that there was a revolution of love in the 11th century that was actually more revolutionary than the Reformation. And when you turn on the radio today, every song we hear is about love. And we think that love makes us better people. But we have to remember, in classical antiquity, that's not their approach to love. They still loved, but they saw love as an obstacle to be overcome, right? And the third, maybe most important value that the Aeneid tells us was the Roman value of conquest. In the middle of Virgil's poem comes a passage that was designed to serve as a thesis statement for the entire Roman project. And I'll read you half a paragraph. Let others better mold the running mass of metals, and inform the breathing brass, and soften into flesh a marble face, plead better at the bard. Describe the skies when the stars descend and when they rise, but Rome, 'tis thine alone, with awful sway, to rule mankind and make the world obey, deposing peace and war by thy own majestic way, to tame the proud and fettered slave to free. These are the imperial arts, and worthy be. That phrase, to rule mankind and make the world obey, was this driving force behind the Roman project, behind the Roman state. And while Aeneas landed in Latium, there were already people there, but that was not a problem. Their divine commission was to conquer, to rule mankind. So they just conquered the people that were already there. And already we begin to see some of the core Roman values that would cause a lot of friction with Christianity when the church started. Now, the Aeneid is one of two founding myths. The other one is probably more recognizable, the story of Romulus and Remus. The most complete version of the story comes from Plutarch, but Plutarch lived about 1,000 years after the events he describes. Ovid is our earliest source for this, and he was writing about 7 AD. Again, right after the Aeneid, right after the establishment of the Roman Empire. And while it does not give us history, Romulus was most certainly the first king of Rome. It tells us important things about how Rome understood itself. And this story is a little bit more familiar. Romulus and Remus were born, son of Rhea Silva, and sons of Mars. Their human mother mated with a god. They were born, they were put into a basket, floated down the Tiber. Sounds a little familiar. Chances are they weren't copying the Moses story. Chances are they were copying the story of Sargon II, which also has this floating baby image. And as they were floating down the Tiber, they got hung up on an island, and a she-wolf who had lost all her pups finds them and nurses them through their teenage years. And as teenagers, Romulus and Remus, the twins, are reunited with their grandfather, who explains to them that they have a destiny to be great Romans, right? So Romulus and Remus go to found a city, a capital city, and they come to the bend in the Tiber where there's the famous 7 hills. And Romulus and Remus have a disagreement over which hill to found the city on. Romulus chooses Palatine Hill, Remus chooses the other hill, which I forget off the top of my head, and they have to appeal to Jupiter again to decide. So Jupiter sends an eagle, and the eagle lands on Palatine Hill, Romulus's hill. So Romulus marks out the boundaries of the new city, and him and his band of followers get to work at constructing it. Remus is a sore loser, and he consistently steps over the boundaries of the city. Now that may not seem like a big deal to us today, but in classical days you could not enter a city without permission, and Remus didn't have permission, so he continually stepped over the boundary line, or as we might say today, he was a habitual line stepper. And if you don't know what that's from, don't worry about it. If you know, you know. Romulus tried to ignore Remus for a while, but eventually ended up killing Remus. Again, devotion to the state, right? But then Romulus was faced with a different problem. Now that he had marked out the boundaries of the city that Jupiter wanted, he needed to populate it. And for that you need women. And his merry band of followers contained no women. So Romulus goes to the neighboring tribe, the Sabines, and asks for some women, and they say no. So Romulus concocts a scheme to put on a spectacle, because everyone in the ancient world liked a spectacle. And he was going to host a spectacle, invited all the Sabines there, and said, hey, this is a social occasion. There's no reason to bring your weapons. So the Sabines show up, and the Romans snatch the women, and when the Sabine men try and pursue them, they're met by a Roman armed guard. Again, a deception, but the Romans were being fierce and brave and violent, so it's okay. This was at the end of fall, so the Sabine men went back to their towns, and they did not prosecute wars in wintertime. So when the Sabine men came back in the spring, they realized all the women that they had left were now pregnant, and they had to make some level of peace with the arrangement. This is known as the rape of the Sabine women, and ancient Romans would not be embarrassed by that story at all. They would actually think it's a story about how clever and brave they were. Now, like I said, it's almost certain that Romulus was the first king of Rome. But this isn't a history. It tells us cultural values. It tells us that Rome was a divinely ordained city. Not only did Jupiter commission Aeneas, Jupiter literally picked the site of Rome on Palatine Hill where the Roman Forum sat, and you can visit Palatine Hill and overlook the Forum today. So that was the place where they founded it. Again, we see devotion to the state, that Romulus's devotion to the state was more important than his love for his brother. It also tells us something very important about how one should rule. And let's remember that these epic poems were written after the failure of the triumvirates, these two groups of 3 rulers. First group of 3 with Julius Caesar, second group of 3, Octavian and Mark Antony. And through the myth of Romulus and Remus, Rome concludes that Rome should never have multiple rulers. There should always be one, right? So that was probably a little propaganda to make sure that a triumvirate never came back. And truthfully, it didn't until the days of Diocletian, and that didn't work out well either. So these foundation myths may not give us the history that moderns might appreciate of Rome, but it does tell us what is important to Rome, what drove Rome, and it'll help us understand the church's friction with the Roman government and sometimes areas of cooperation there. So let us go from myth into history for a little bit. Roman history can be described as how these values have been lived out. And a complete overview of Roman history is fascinating and valuable for understanding church history, but beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. After the first triumvirate, when the first triumvirate ended in the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, there emerged a second triumvirate out of the public outcry over Caesar's assassination. Assassinating Julius Caesar was very popular in the Senate, not popular among the people. Actually, the people were stunned when Julius Caesar died and discovered that in his will he bequeathed a fair amount of his fortune to the Roman people. That was unheard of. So, in its aftermath, a second triumvirate arose, made up of Octavius, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar and his adopted son, who joined Mark Antony and Lepidus to rule over the Roman Empire. And as the cautionary tale of Romulus and Remus suggested, power sharing is not a good idea in Rome. It doesn't end well. But the problem was, after Rome deposed its kings in 509 BC, Roman society developed a strong allergy to the king. It will never accept a king or anything that smacked of monarchy. So when the second triumvirate ended with the victory of Octavian, later known as Augustus, he had to overcome the appearance of being a king. So he invented what's called the Principate, or the Principate. And Octavian adopted the title of Princeps, which means the first citizen. So while he was the number one sole undisputed leader, he was not a king, he was the first citizen. And eventually he adopted the title of emperor. Now you and I can be forgiven for not really seeing much of a difference between a king and an emperor, but to ancient Romans that distinction was very important. And Augustus began a series of rulers known as the Principate that would rule through 284 when Diocletian formed the Tetrarchy, and he began to dominate. Augustus himself ruled from 27 BC through AD 19, so he was the emperor under whom Jesus was born. And instead of rule going to one son, like you would in a monarchy, the emperors would adopt sons. They would get to handpick their successor, and Augustus's handpicked successor was Tiberius. And he would rule from AD 14 through 37. So he would be the ruler during Jesus' death. And under Tiberius is the earliest church structure when it developed. Now, when you have a hereditary succession, you really have no idea how your son is going to be as a ruler. Even when you adopt a handpicked successor, there is varying qualities of rulers. And during the Principate, the nadir, the low point of the rulers was Nero. And in the year Nero died, in AD 69, it was known as the year of 4 emperors, that Rome went through 4 different emperors in 1 year. So Rome was not doing well in AD 69. And when Vespasian finally took control, he introduced a new ruling house, so to speak, the Flavian dynasty. And from the Flavian dynasty comes what we know as the 5 good emperors. Stability, prosperity, that lasted from AD 96 to 180. And we'll talk about how the church did under these rulers in a later lecture. But the reason why we're given this brief overview of Roman history is to show that the Roman Empire was applying its own mythological values of conquest, the state, things like that. And at the inception of the church, the Roman Empire was not thinking about this small, unknown band of seeming heretics from Jerusalem. They were this small group. When Jesus died, his followers were about 500. And we're talking a Roman Empire of millions of people. It would be some time before Christianity popped up on the radar of the Roman Empire. And as Daniel explained to King Nebuchadnezzar, this fourth and terrible kingdom would be shattered by a rock. And it implies that this rock was a very small rock because it grew to cover the entire earth. But during the Principate, Christianity was this backwater movement that thoroughly confused the Romans. And the reason why the Romans were confused was because Christianity was qualitatively different from their religious assumptions and practices. In order to understand Roman culture, what the Christians dealt with, we have to understand a few things about Roman religion. And like the ancient Greeks, Rome assumed this universalist approach to pagan religion, that the gods in the Roman pantheon were actually gods. And they may be known by other names in other cultures, but they were the same god. Zeus was known as Marduk in Babylon, known as Amun-Ra in Egypt. And they assumed that even foreign people worshiped the same gods that Rome did. Now Rome added some of the gods that they had not run into as they conquered, but they just felt like they were missing those gods. They weren't Persian gods, they were gods, and only Persia knew about them. That's an important distinction. They believed that the gods can reveal themselves to anyone however they want, but they were still able to recognize them. Now, one characteristic of Greek and Roman religion was the idea of religious observance. They didn't have any expectation of getting to know a personal creator god. The gods were distant and capricious. Greek gods were a little bit more personal in that they intermingled with humans more often than the Roman gods did. But Roman approach to religion is best summarized by the Latin phrase do ut des. I give as you give. We might say, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. The job of people was to appease the gods, and the job of the gods was to shower favor upon those people, right? And people would try and appease the gods in exchange for everything from fertility to victory in battle. And appeasement meant showing the proper respect to the god through offerings. And this required a significant infrastructure, right? Temples, statues, priests, the offerings themselves, so on and so forth. And the Romans developed a term for this, pietas, what we call piety. But pietas in Latin actually meant obligation. That humans showed piety by fulfilling their obligation to the gods and showing respect. And what was true on a state level was true on a personal level. So the basic unit of Roman life was the family. And a family usually included extended relatives and was ruled by a patriarch known as the pater familia. And most of the gods the family would worship were either local gods or ancestors. And each home had a small shrine where food was put out for those offerings. So when we look at not local family religion, but civic religion, just imagine that same dynamic projected on a much bigger screen, right? What was true on the family level was true on the state level. Jupiter, the chief of the Roman gods, is actually a combination of the term Jove pater, or Father Jove. So Jupiter was understood as the pater familias of the gods in the same way that a patriarch in a family was known as the pater familias. And instead of small household shrines in the cities, you had large temples with tall statues and offerings and an entire temple administrative complex with priests and lamentation singers and virgins and all of it. But remember, the goal of Roman religion was not to develop a personal relationship with Jupiter or Mars, but to appease them so that they would show them favor, do ut des, right? And since religion revolved around the pietas, these obligations, issues of purity and ritual were central to the practice of Roman religion. So if you talk to an ancient Roman or Greek about faith, did you have faith in these gods? They wouldn't know what you're talking about. Gods weren't people to have faith in or not faith in. I mean, they were there. Your role was to perform a certain action so that the gods are appeased. Even if you hated that god, even if you didn't even really believe in that god, didn't matter. So now we see some of the fault lines between Roman religion and the message of Christianity. And I believe one of the reasons why Christianity was attractive was its difference from it. In addition to local religion, civic religion, you also had developing what I call the imperial cult, or the cult of the ruler. And this developed over a long period of time. Egyptian pharaohs had a long history of being deified, considered gods. Ancient Babylon, a couple of kings claimed deity, but only 3, really. In Persia, it was pretty regular to worship the king as a god. And in the Greek world, the imperial cult really developed under Alexander the Great, when he was declared the son of Zeus at Siwa. And when he went into Persia and realized, oh wow, these people worship their king as a god, and I'm obviously better than these kings because I conquered these kings, so I'm a god. There is some Roman precedent for deifying a ruler. That Romans did believe that Romulus, the very first king, was deified as Quirinius. But when Augustus emerged from the Second Triumvirate, there really had not been a history in Rome of deifying emperors. Augustus was seen as restoring the majesty Rome lost after the assassination of Julius Caesar, who, incidentally, was assassinated in the temple of Quirinius, the deified original Roman leader, Romulus, right? And because Augustus was seen as the person who rescued Rome from the mistake of the first triumvirate, Augustus accepted the title of savior, soter, right? And the principle behind the deification of the Roman emperors had already been in place, but Augustus was the one that kind of turned it into deification. For generations, Roman people had thought that the souls of their leaders, the souls of these Roman leaders, had a different destiny than everyone else's soul, even if they didn't worship them as emperor. Augustus did accept worship as a god, but he was still not technically considered divine until after his death, and the Senate conferred divinity upon him. And after Augustus, there were several emperors that actually resisted being worshipped as a god. Tiberius, Claudius, and Vespasian. But then there were others that sought it, promoted it. Caligula, Nero, and Domitian. I think it's interesting that that list has something else in common. Tiberius, Claudius, and Vespasian are generally known as good emperors, whereas Caligula, Nero, and Domitian, maybe not so much. But as a general rule, when the empire was ailing, when there were social problems among this vast people, emperors looked to the imperial cult to impose a sense of belonging and purpose among its citizens. How could one fulfill Jupiter's commission to rule mankind and make the world obey if they did not respect Jupiter, right? So around the time of Jesus' birth, Jerusalem was ruled by a leader, a Roman leader, with an exclusive claim, who styled himself as a savior, who accepted worship, who claimed to be the King of Kings, and even sought elevation to a divine status. when we remember that, we see that it's not a stretch to discern some of the problems that the early church would have within such a context. So we're going to complete our overview of the introduction to church history with our third lecture on the Jewish world.